This is a conversation with Paul J. He's a filmmaker popularly known for the documentaries Hitman Heart, Wrestling with Shadows, and Return to Kandahar, and a journalist who was the former producer of the debate programs Counterspin and Face Off on CBC, and the founder of independent media platforms like the Real News Network and theAnalysis-news. It's interesting, this journey that you've gone through from filmmaking to the news and now back to filmmaking. Filmmaking was your first love when you were at the experimental school, Everdale.
Can I interrupt?
Sure.
It wasn't my first love.
What was?
My first love was a girl that lived on my street when I was 8.
Okay.
And it was never about my first love, filmmaking. It was always a means to an end. The debate show, whatever I did in media wasn't because I loved doing media. It's because it was a means to an end. If tomorrow you could say, I don't know, make me president of the United States tomorrow instead of making films, I'd rather do that.
Let's explore that journey through films, because when someone donated a camera in Everdale, you started off by making a film about this rich kid who shed his clothing and fought monsters. Yeah. But very quickly, like you mentioned, it was a means to an end. You started exploring the world through the camera lens. You've made a documentary about Las Vegas after you heard a commercial in the dentist chair. You've done 2 about pro wrestling, Bret Hart, Owen Hart. You've done
way too much research on me.
You underestimate the interns who do my research. I don't have the time for it now. You've done documentaries about cowboys in Alberta, about the Quebec referendum, about Coco the gorilla and the birth of language, and about Afghanistan with Nilofer Pazira. And you said in a previous interview, which is why I said this is interesting, you said that even though you enjoyed the process of filmmaking, you felt at that point it didn't have the same reach or the impact or the influence as the daily news, which is why you want to start putting more effort in the daily news itself. Do you think that's shifting now, and you're clearly shifting your efforts as well? Because at least with the newer generation, it feels like not many people watch the daily news, but they do consume documentaries, films on Netflix. So maybe that's a better way now to persuade them and send a message.
Daily news still has more impact. Sure. But you need a platform that has impact. So you need both sides of it. It's fine to be daily, but if not enough people are watching, it doesn't make any difference. You know, if somebody handed me a show tomorrow on mainstream television daily, you know, I still want to finish this movie, but I think I might have more impact. Like, see, the debate show on a mainstream platform, you know, or CBC News Channel, we had tremendous impact, more than any film could have. We were shaping the public discourse day after day after day.
Would it still work today?
If I could have the same model, which was an independent show, in the entire 10 years of doing that show, nobody from CBC even once told me you can't do such and such, because we were smart about it. We always treated the show in the end that it had to be the best show. We didn't have a propaganda objective, meaning we booked the best right-wing guests we could find. We didn't beat, you know, if you weren't clever, if you couldn't make the argument, if you didn't know some history, we wouldn't book you to be the fall guy for some smart left-winger. Quite the contrary. Some of the lefty guests we would book often lost the debate because they were so used to talking to each other. They didn't have to face up to some of the smarter right-wing arguments. So in all the time, we used to get, you know, the most controversial shows, of course, would be about Israel. So I once did a show with the guy that wrote that great book on the Lebanese War, the very famous journalist, British journalist.
Robert Fisk?
Robert Fisk. So I once did a debate with Robert Fisk versus I needed to get an Israeli representative. So I said, well, who's the most authoritative person we can get? And I'm not sure who suggested it, but the idea was, let's get Yuri Dan. Now, Yuri Dan was one of the most famous pundit journalists in Israel, and in many articles was referred to as Ariel Sharon's only trusted two people in Israel, Yuri Dan and his son. So how do you get more authoritative than that? And it was an interesting conversation, too, because my staff was having trouble getting Yuri Dan to say yes. And they asked, you're the exec producer, will you talk to him? So I said, sure. So I'm talking to Yuri Dan, and he says, have you been to Israel? I said, oh, yeah, my sister lived on a kibbutz there for almost 10 years. And he said, what did you think? I said, oh, it's such a beautiful country. It's so beautiful. So he decides I'm on his side of the barricades, and he starts talking about greater Israel. He says, if we have to lose one Jewish life, or 1,000, 1,000 Jewish lives every year for 100 years, someday, from the river to the sea, that's the first time I ever heard that phrase, was out of Yuri Dan's mouth, it will all be ours. Anyway, we have this debate. Fisk mops the floor with him. Well, my business manager, who did all my business stuff for the debate show and my films, he was an Orthodox Jew. And I made sure if we ever did a show that had anything to do with Israel, he'd sit in on our meetings and make and see if we were being fair about who we booked as guests, because we always were. Anyway, after this debate between Fisk and Yuri Dan, I get these complaints. I guess, I don't know, one of the big Jewish pro-Israel groups in Canada, I can't remember which one. I think it may have been Bernie Farber was it. Anyway, they complain about the show to CBC. No, they complain to me first. And they say, oh, it wasn't fair. Why'd you do this? So I said, well, come and see me, which is what I always used to do when they complain. Come see me and we'll talk about it. So they came and they went on about how it wasn't fair. I said, well, first of all, let me get my head of business affairs to sit down here with us. So David would come in. He had his big black hat on. He had his... the curls, and he wasn't always, but he had become quite a serious Orthodox Jew. So he sat down, and they looked a little bit shocked. And I asked him, listen, you were in our story meetings. Do you think we were fair? And he said, yeah, you booked the Yuri Dan. He's like practically Ariel Sharon's brother. Anyway, we kept doing that. So in all the years we did the show, there wasn't one serious complaint, but I think it was a little weird moment in time that we got such a show. We were the only independent news show for CBC, and there's never been one again. And it was just this weird moment where because Ron Haggard had worked at CBC, we got this show. It did very well, and the ratings were great for 10 years. But is such a show possible now? I don't think so. But if it wasn't, yeah, I'd be hard-pressed not to do a daily show. Now, it wouldn't have any American impact, but if you offered me a show on MSNBC or what do they call it, MS Now, or anywhere, I'd do it on Fox. If you allow me to run the show the way I ran that show, I would do it, and it would have more impact. Maybe not this movie. This movie, I think, is going to change the way people look at the world in a profound way. If we can do it the way I'm hoping, this How to Stop a Nuclear War film is going to unpack the Cold War and militarization of economies in a way no one's seen before. But other films, I would do The Daily Show if I had the right platform.
Let's explore this even further, because I'm very interested in the power and influence of documentaries, of movies, and the subtext that can be infused in it. Let's take a very extreme example. You've created one of the best documentaries in pro wrestling.
No, I created one of the best documentaries, period. Don't say in pro wrestling. Just happens to be about pro wrestling. I got a quote from a reviewer that said, as bizarre as Kafka and as dramatic as Shakespeare. So that was from the Ottawa Citizen. So.
Well, you've created one of the great documentaries, period. Hitman Hart, Wrestling with Shadows, about Bret Hart and the Montreal Screwjob. And this is exactly what I want to explore, which is in a way, you're part of the generation that's witnessed the peak of pro wrestling. And many people dismiss pro wrestling as, oh, it's just goofy and the caricatures of some form of entertainment. But how much of even pro wrestling, I'm not even going for any of the serious documentaries, how much of pro wrestling as well was a reflection of the zeitgeist of the time? So was Hulk Hogan more than just a performer, but also a projection of what American values was within Stone Cold Steve Austin a decade later, Bret Hart in Canada? Did these wrestlers, did this form of entertainment also stand for something more? There was a lot more subtext. Or am I giving too much importance to a goofy entertainment show?
No, I mean, the writers of the scripts for pro wrestling are very clever. I've more or less stopped following it after I made the movie. I mean, I wasn't like a wrestling fan, but the writers are smart. And, Vince McMahon and others, they're very politically tuned in. I mean, his wife is in Trump's cabinet. And they're very, very connected to the audience. Because they do live shows, it's not like a Netflix movie where you wait to see who watched and there's numbers and you have to guess people going to like this or not like this. In professional wrestling, night after night after night, practically, maybe at least once a week, twice a week, you have a live audience of, 15, 18,000 and sometimes 40, 50,000, in big stadiums. They fill the places up. You immediately find out if a certain storyline pops. If the audience gets off their feet, if they scream and they clap and they boo and they yell. If a storyline works and a particular wrestler works, they have immediate feedback. And the same thing the other way. If storyline's a dud and such wrestler gets the mic and makes a speech and everyone falls asleep. So they're very tuned to immediate feedback. And usually what's working in the arenas, as far as I know, works on television. And when I made the film, but it's still pretty big. And now Netflix has adopted it. I mean, it's on Netflix all over the place now. But at one point, it's like 500 million people a week around the world were watching it. So it was quite a phenomenon. The wrestling characters play emotions. There's a great Roland Barthes who was this seminologist. And he had a great essay about pro wrestling in Paris in the 1950s. But he made the point that, a wrestler plays coward, another one plays hero, another one plays villain. Like they play very primal emotions. But as the storylines had to get more sophisticated, the old good guy, bad guy wrestler wasn't nearly enough. And what Vince McMahon was brilliant at doing was getting the storylines rooted and responding to popular culture. I don't think wrestling created the popular culture. That's grows out of many, many factors and systems and television and Hollywood, and it's a whole complex media system. But they were very good, and they did play politics. So during the height of the Cold War, there's always a Russian villain in wrestling. And when it's about terrorism, there's some Islamist villain in wrestling. As the society became more and more open, for better or worse, to overt sexuality, like in my film, that's what's beginning to play out in the World Wrestling Federation. In fact, there's Vince McMahon actually says somewhere where the days of wrestlers telling you to drink your milk and take your vitamins is over. And they really start going down this road of hypersexualized characters, more female wrestlers that are also hypersexualized. So what pops for an audience is a reflection of where the culture is at. He's not driving it, but he really knows how to take advantage of it. But the more important thing about wrestling and culture is that American politics is like wrestling. And there's a thing called Kayfabe in wrestling. So if two wrestlers are in a restaurant and they're talking about they're out of character, and they're talking about the real business, fuck that Vince, he I wanted to win such and such match, and I needed to climb the ladder, and I'll get paid more, and blah, blah, blah. And anyway, they're having a real conversation about the business. And someone sits down and can hear them in the next booth in the restaurant. Quickly, one of the wrestlers says, "Kayfabe." And they go into character. So kayfabe is this whole culture that wrestling is real. And before my film, the majority of the wrestling audience didn't know. They thought it was real. Some knew. It is a real, Brett says in the film, making it look like you just got smacked in the face is an art. And the good wrestlers, I've been 10 feet from guys having a fight, quote unquote. And I actually thought they'd lost it and were actually fighting. I'm 10 feet away from Shawn Michaels and Bret Hart smashing each other on the cement outside the ring. And I turned to my camera person and I said, "I think they're actually fighting." They weren't. But in American politics, there's this whole veneer, and it didn't start in the Cold War. It's been there from the beginning, and it predates America. Why did peasants volunteer to go fight in the Crusades? The lies, the fabric of lies that ruling classes have been telling people throughout class society to get ordinary people to go fight and die for feudal aristocracies, for slave systems. Because you're born into a society, it becomes part of your identity. You believe that the church says such and such. Your religious leaders say such and such, and the king is there because God made that person king. You believe this stuff. And you don't have much choice but to believe it, because if you don't go along with it, you're going to starve or you're going to get killed. So American politics is like kayfabe politics. There's a theater of politics and the real business of billionaire interest, lobbying, bilking the public treasury through militarization and other kinds of essentially corrupt practices. So the parallel between the theater of wrestling and the theater of politics, that's the thing. I want to make another wrestling movie, a drama, which is really going to explore this. And it's no accident that Trump learned how to make crowds pop in the wrestling ring. He was actually a WWF storyline. It was called the Battle of the Billionaires. Trump versus Vince McMahon. Whoever's wrestler, they each picked one. And the one that lost, the other billionaire got to shave the other guy's head. So Trump eventually shaves Vince McMahon's head. But that was actually quite a premonition, because that's what we're living in now. A society run by the battle of the billionaire. They run the society, and then between them they fight and vie for more position and more wealth and more power. But as a class, they rule. But there's a fiction, which is they have a political theater in Congress, in the White House, that plays itself out when everybody knows the real powers with the billionaire.
I have the actual quote by Roland Barthes from the world of wrestling. He said, "Wrestling is like great spectacles, like Greek drama and bullfights. In both, a light without shadow generates an emotion without reserve. There are people who think that wrestling is an ignoble sport. Wrestling is not a sport, it is a spectacle." And then he goes on to describe how wrestlers almost position themselves as modern age gods, embody moral traits, it's good versus evil. Like you've said, a clear analogy between pro wrestlers and politicians, like candidates in an election. John Ralston Saul, in fact, says politicians they have to be actors. They have to have catchphrases in order to win an election, because you cannot commit the cardinal sin of actually talking something sensible, or the public is going to get terrified if someone actually questions themselves in public or thinks critically. So I completely agree with you. You brought up the rule by the billionaires and the elite class. So let's walk into that. In 2008, on the George Stephanopoulos show, there was a debate between Donna Brazil and George Will. And Donna Brazil was going on and on about how can John McCain ever understand what the American people want? He's got 7 houses. How's he ever going to know? And George Will is getting red in the face, and he finally blurts out saying, even FDR was American aristocracy. So it's time to quit being sentimental in a democracy, because the real question that we have to settle in an election is not whether the elite shall rule, but which elite shall rule.
Yeah, which section. Yeah.
You've studied politics for over 3 decades now. So this doesn't just relate to America. It could go across America, across time. Has it always been this way? Has it always been the elite in power, or has it been different at any point?
First of all, that is one of my favorite quotes of all time. That's George Will quote. I must have referred to it about 100 times. And I think he did it. He said something that they don't say in public, that you only get to choose which section of the elites. He says, let's not be naive. I don't think he would have said it if Brazil hadn't so pissed him off about all this stuff about, who was it, McCain's houses?
Yeah, McCain.
Yeah. Has it always been this way? Well, I think the way I understand the history of humans, and, I did a film called The Birth of Language. I got to talk to a lot of anthropologists and such. I think it's the evidence shows, and nobody was there because it's thousands of years ago. But the evidence seems to show that the early humans, what made us human, why we don't have big teeth, why we're not the size of gorillas, is that we started to evolve in a way that collective action was more effective than individual power. So the key thing is the development of tool making. Because if you can evolve, if the brain and bipedalism and the opposable thumb, all these random things that adapt and make us more successful as a species, culminated with, and you can see some of the primitive use of tools in chimpanzees, where they take a stick and they shove it in a thing and get an ant out of a log or something. But it wasn't the primary way they existed. It wasn't their economy. It was a little subset, and once in a while you get an ant out. Otherwise, you're out picking fruit off trees. Humans, this branch of primates that became the humans, the key thing that evolved for us was we became more and more cooperative. And if we hunted cooperatively, you could do way better than even one or two individuals of the species. And over time, the random events that then create these adaptations, we became more and more tribal. And then with tool making, we start to develop the key thing that differentiates us from animals, which is we start to think with language. We start to talk to ourselves. We have to go beyond primitive animal communication. Because if you can look at a rock and you can imagine a spear point in that rock, and then you can start chipping away at that rock and end up with something sharp, that's the beginning of a kind of consciousness, an abstraction, where you can think and think to yourself. Like, one of the most important things in that language film I think I learned is that it wasn't just about, and maybe not even mostly about, communication with others. A lot of it was about communication with yourself. You actually can say to yourself, oh, I could make a spear out of that rock. That obviously isn't going to be English, but in some kind of language. But the critical thing, the demarcation that comes with that, is collective action. And it's pretty clear in early tribal societies, and I mean, even up until the 1800s, an anthropologist named Morgan, and there were others, who contacted and explored indigenous societies that had not yet had any contact with Europeans. The evidence is there was no private property. That the property was tribal, and they were still hunters and gatherers, and they picked berries, and they hunted wild game, buffalo, but no agriculture, no animal husbandry. And in those societies, there's no evidence of private property, or absolutely minimal. which also meant no evidence of classes. Most of those societies, not all, but most, seem to be matriarchies. There's no property to hand down. So the issue of inheritance wasn't really an issue. What the best theory thinking so far that I'm aware of, and all these things are, best more than speculation because it is based on observation of these tribes. But we weren't there, so you can't say definitively. But it seems when agriculture creates a surplus, and you can start, instead of chasing animals all over the place, put them in pens, and you now have a reliable supply of meat and milk and hides, you start developing a surplus. And society starts to divide. Who's going to control the surplus? Because up until then, there was no reason to want to, because everybody depended on the tribe for survival. You got a surplus, somebody who's stronger starts to think, well, you know what? I'm stronger. I'm hunting more than they are. Maybe I should own this. The objectivity of the development of the economic foundation, the transition to agriculture and animal husbandry, starts giving rise to ideas and consciousness, which is, we have more than we need. Maybe I should control that. Or maybe I'm the better hunter. Maybe I should get a bigger share. So society starts to divide. Who's going to control the surplus? But the big next beat, the big beat, is people who are in the stronger category. They see something else they want to own. Weaker people. The beginning of slave society is the real transition to the world we're living in today. Because the original private property that really mattered, that really shaped our civilization, were slaves. And it takes place in, as far as I know, almost, if not all, but there's always some exceptions. Practically all human development went through slave society. And Western civilization is based on a culture that grew out of slave society, whether it's Greek or Roman, or even the Vikings. The Nords go down into France and they capture slaves. Like the economy of that age was all based on slavery. And Western, this thing they want to keep defending, these Steve Bannons of the world, we're going to defend Judeo-Christian civilization. What is that civilization? It's a civilization that was based on slavery. And of course, right up into modern times, relatively modern times, which is the origin of America, is slave society. Not, of course, indentured labor, but then black slaves. So we are living in a culture today, which are just variations on slave society. We mostly, not completely, but mostly transitioned from outright chattel slavery into what others, Marx, but other people have called wage slavery. But what ordinary people don't understand is that the elites, who were the slave owners, where the culture originates, it grows, where is our culture? There's some good things to slavery. It gave the elites time to think. They didn't have to go work all day long. They didn't have to be in the tribe every day out hunting and doing this and doing that. It gave rise to a class of intellectuals. Our ability to understand nature, the origins of science, also come out of slave society. It was if you get rid of moral judgments, it was a necessary stage in human development. And, gave us a lot of why we're thinking conscious people today, at least some of us are. But that culture of ruling elites that originated in slave society, they look at the slaves, or the wage slaves, as less than human. How do you justify slavery? How do you justify killing people because they don't obey your orders? and then extend that to wars. How do you send people off to war? To get slaughtered. For what? It's because you see people as less than human. And we're living in a world today where the culture of the ruling elites, virtually everywhere, some minor exceptions, were workers, call them peasants, poor people. They're expendable. They're there to be used or abused or killed. And you can send your own people off to war. I mean, how does the United States live with having killed millions and millions and millions of people since World War II? Never mind the genocide of indigenous people and all the killing that took place before World War II. And the war that started it all, the template for the whole military-industrial complex, the template for being able to justify the slaughter of millions, is a war nobody wants to talk about. And it's the Korean War. They call it the Forgotten War. Well, they want people to forget about it because it's the beginning of the most aggressive era. The Korean War, in many ways, picks up where the Nazis left off. Now, I'm not saying the crimes committed by the Nazis were, people don't like doing comparisons, but the fact is, the Americans, the only force that has killed more people than the Americans have killed since World War II were the British before World War II. Because some people estimate the British Empire over 300-400 years might have killed as much as 1 billion people, directly and indirectly. Indirectly meaning deliberately caused famines. But the Korean War killed around 3 million. The Vietnam War, I think in the same, 3 to 5 million. The Americans only talk about how many American soldiers were killed, but that isn't really the issue, is it? Then you go to the Iraq War, and then you go to all the, in Indonesia, American-backed dictator kills 1 million people in something under 3 weeks, leftists, socialists, communists. Like the millions and millions killed in the name of defending democracy, defending freedom, fighting communism. That's part of it. I go back to the very beginning of the interview. American identity puts all of that in this compartment. And here's the name of the compartment. America does bad things, but for good reasons. Everyone else does bad things for bad reasons. We do bad things only for freedom and democracy. We're here to save civilization. And yeah, you got to break some eggs to do it. So they have all these justifications where you can mentally put all the horrors that actually are in the news for a while, like during the Iraq War. What's happened in Gaza. People saw with their own eyes. And it starts to fade away because nobody talks about it. And then there's no conclusions drawn about it. I mean, everybody now knows, most people know that the Iraq War was based on absolute out-and-out lies. There were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Everybody knew it. The inspectors were telling them. They went into Iraq because there were no weapons of mass destruction. If they really believed it, do we really think they would have invaded? It's like saying they would invade Korea. Well, we know they won't invade Korea because everyone knows they do have weapons of mass destruction. What's his name? Colin Powell goes to the UN. He says Baghdad is surrounded by missiles with biological weapons aimed at Tel Aviv. Well, if you think that's true, do you actually invade? And when your guys are going in on these tanks and jeeps, half of them aren't even wearing gas masks. The Korean War, the mother of all this lying and BS, total lies. North Korea invaded South Korea. There was no North Korea. There was just a Korea. The only thing that started this South and North Korea is the Americans created this fabrication that there's a South Korea and got this completely compliant UN to buy in. So we've had massive killing based on lie after lie after lie. And I forget specifically what your question was.
I can bring us back. Initially, when you spoke about the transition from apes to humans.
Was there ever a society? The answer is yes. But because of an objective process, this is very important actually. The economic objectivity happens almost spontaneously. It's not like somebody sat down and let's have animal husbandry. Over a long, long time, through experimentation, slowly humans learned that you don't have to chase animals all over the damn place. You can put them in a pen. And then slowly that gets to scale. It starts changing the economic foundation. See, there's a thing I like, this way to look at it. There's this great phrase from Shakespeare. All the world is a stage and all the men and women merely players on it. Well, the vast majority of our news, of our academics, of people that study history and stuff, all they focus on is the players. They don't want to ask who owns the stage, who built the stage, who commissioned the play. They focus on the players, which are these political figures that are more than half theater. But you cannot understand the play. You can't understand society if you don't understand the economic foundations of that society, which is two main issues. How do we produce? Are we picking berries, or we have industrial production? We have AI. I mean, how do we produce? And then number two, who owns it? Is it a small segment of society that privately owns it? Or do we own it publicly? Now, most modern economies are actually a mix. There's hardly a modern capitalist country that doesn't have public ownership. Some, even more, like China is I think, a modern capitalist country in the main, although it's a complicated hybrid, but very significant state ownership. Russia's a capitalist country, an oligarchy, significant state ownership. So even in the US, lots of the hospitals are state-owned. Most of the schools are still publicly owned. The highways are publicly owned. One of the biggest things there is publicly owned. It's called the Pentagon. So the American economy is a hybrid of publicly owned socialistic elements. But because of private ownership, the state, government, mostly governs on behalf of the ownership class, the slave owners. Not entirely, certain amount, depending what country you're in. This is what forces around Trump want now. They want a much more unmitigated capitalism. They want to get rid of regulation. They call it the administrative state. They're fed up with any restrictions on billionaire power. But why were those restrictions there in the first place? They were there because capitalism worked better with those regulations. Why do they have antitrust regulations? Because the elites know, when I say elites, they're thinkers, know that the natural gravitation of capitalism is towards monopoly. Big fish want to eat little fish. If Coke had its way, there'd be no Pepsi. So they have laws to make sure there's at least some competition. They're very weak. We are very monopolized. By the way, more so in Canada even. Our telecoms in Canada are more monopolized than in the US. But they had to have antitrust, or they would have ended up with 4 big banks that owned everything, and they would have controlled the government. And in 1938, FDR sent a letter to Congress. Nobody talks about it. Fascinating letter. And essentially, in overt words, says, if one section of capital gets control of the state, that will be the very definition of American fascism. That's Roosevelt in 1938 in a letter to Congress. And that's where we are. For decades and decades, since the end of World War II, there's a section of capital that's been trying to get hold of the state and have an unmitigated pre-New Deal America, where billionaires, well, it's interesting. I did this piece people should watch. It's called Trump's Unholy Alliance. And Mark Cuban, who is an American billionaire, who's a little more honest about stuff, he says what these guys want, by these guys, he's talking about the billionaires around Trump. They want the billionaires to be the board of directors, the president to be their CEO, and get rid of elections. And as long as the CEO performs, he's the president. And if they don't like him, they can fire him. That's the society they want to live in. And Peter Thiel, who's the billionaire, one of the founders of PayPal, this militarized AI company, Palantir, he's one of the great ideologues of this. And he says in no uncertain terms, democracy and modern capitalism are no longer compatible. So a big section of the American elites, that's where they want to go. And they're saying, some of them are saying, and this was clear to me years ago, we cannot compete with China if we remain an electoral democracy. If you want to compete, you got to be as arbitrary and have the power that the Chinese Communist Party has. They'll rail against it, but they want it. Because then you can have a command economy that the Silicon Valley billionaires who think they know better than anyone about everything, they'll create an economy, they'll create a country with a plan that they will just dictate. And they love the Chinese model. They just want it for themselves. And of course, they won't call it communist. They will call it Christian. And they'll do it in the name of Jesus. And if there was anything opposite of what Jesus actually stood for, it's that. I mean, Jesus says the rich have as much chance of getting into heaven as a camel walking through the eye of a needle. I mean, Jesus was a radical communist, literally. If you put Jesus quotes there and you don't tell somebody who it is, they're going to say, oh my God, that's a raving socialist. Trump will say, that's a lunatic left. I mean, in their definition, Jesus Christ is the lunatic left, which is why even Pope Leo and Francis were attacking the Trumpians. We're at an existential point in human civilization. We're culminating. We're getting to the point now, whether it's climate crisis or more immediately, nuclear war, a new pandemic, and AI on its own as an existential threat, but even more militarized AI, especially militarized within the nuclear weapons framework. We are, in historical terms, moments away from saying humans are done. But all the potential for a new society already exists. And in fact, this is what most people don't understand what Marx actually said. Partly because of all the anti-communist stuff and partly because the mutation that socialism became in the Soviet Union and Stalinism, which was a complete mutation of what Marx and Engels talked about. I mean, people should read Lenin's State and Revolution, which was an analysis of the Paris Commune when the workers took over Paris in 1871, the most democratic model of government you could imagine. And it never happened in the Soviet Union. And Lenin was extremely disappointed, even though he was part of what happened. But the gist of it was, of Marx and Engels, was capitalism will reach a point where big monopolies will be so internally well organized that if you socialize them, like imagine a publicly owned Amazon, publicly owned FedEx, publicly owned Walmart. If you take these beautifully internally engineered enterprises that now exist in an overall economy, that's anarchy, chaos, crashes, and then you have unless since last weeks as we talk, oil's up, oil's down, markets are up, markets are down. It's chaos. And if you know how to play it, you're making money when it goes up and you're making money when it's down, because if you're in the inside of this capitalist circle, there's nothing more profitable than volatility, as long as you can predict the volatility. And AI has made predicting the volatility even easier. I mean, they always did it, but boy, can they predict it now. And you have high-speed trading and all the rest of the stuff. So, but the plus side of it is, if you had publicly owned AI, you could actually have a democratic, decentralized, planned economy. You could have a myriad of forms of ownership, city ownership, state ownership, provincial or state. It doesn't all have to be concentrated in the federal government. It doesn't have to be, certainly not concentrated in one party. It doesn't matter whether a party starts off with the best intentions or not. Single party rule has clearly proven to be undemocratic in the end. But AI changes the scenario. It opens up all kinds of possibilities, only if it's in the public interest, which is what's so fascinating about the court case that, I don't know, by the time this airs, maybe it will be over. But it's such a joke to see Elon Musk fighting with Sam Altman over whether OpenAI was supposed to be publicly owned or not. Of course it should have been publicly owned. Of course it's dangerous to be privately owned. And even Altman and Musk knew it when they created OpenAI. They knew this better be public. But the pressures of capitalist accumulation, meaning Microsoft, which started funding that little private venture that eventually ate the nonprofit. So it became really a totally for-profit company. And as I say, it's a joke that Musk, of all people, is the one making the case. But on this particular point, he's right. But if we had publicly owned AI with real regulation on how far we allow AI to go in terms of how autonomous it gets, how powerful it gets, and dealing with issues of the environment too. There's massive data centers and so on. But it can open up a real possibility for a modern form of socialism that's actually democratic. And we haven't really seen that before. And I'll just add one more point, and I'll give you a chance to say something. People say, how come we've never seen a democracy, a socialist democracy? All we saw was Russia, China. I think Cuba is a more complex question, but still it was single party rule. How come we never found it? The answer is simple. Excuse me for swearing. Because you fucks killed anyone that tried it. Allende was going to do that in Chile. Democratically elected leader was going to develop a democratic form of socialism. And you organized it, you being the CIA, you guys killed the guy. Every time there's been any attempt to do it electorally, democratically, right back to 1948. The Italian Communist Party was poised to win the elections in 1948. The Americans poured millions of dollars to sway it to the Christian Democrats, so the communists. And they were not Soviet communists. They wanted to do it democratically. And they were going to reform the economy, slowly. It wasn't meant to just expropriate everything. But they didn't want anything that smelled anything of socialism. And they created in Italy a secret organization all through Europe. And it was called the Glado, I think. Gladio. It's a crazy thing. The Americans, together with MI6, working with local elites in all the European countries, created a secret organization in almost every country. And the supposed reason to have these things was that if the Soviets ever invaded, these armed groups would have weapons stored all over the place, and they could start organizing guerrilla resistance to the Soviet invasion. Now, they knew there were no plans for Soviet invasion. The CIA was telling the Truman administration over and over again, the Soviet Union's in a defensive posture. The whole Cold War was a whole fabric of lies. Anyway, they create this thing, and what was it really? To stop the communists and socialists winning elections. So Gladio helps create an organization in Italy called P2. Berlusconi comes out of P2. P2 was working with the mafia. And they started staging, and not only in Italy, they did this in other countries, terrorist attacks that were blamed on the left. It was like the Reichstag fire. And it's well documented. And the reason it's well documented is because one of the Italian prime ministers, I guess it's in the 70s, I have to get the exact date, a lefty, left of center, any guy, finally gets elected, and he actually conducts an investigation into P2. And it comes out quite publicly through a parliamentary investigation. So the role of P2 and Berlusconi and all of this, it all came out. I mean, this isn't just some internet conspiracy stuff. And the church committee that investigated the CIA, I guess that's also in the mid-late 70s. Tons of this kind of stuff came out of the church committee and the role of the CIA in Europe and so on. So why haven't we seen democratic forms of socialism? Because the Americans and the British and the Germans, and then with the help of the Israelis and various other intelligence agencies, either directly militarily intervene, Korea to begin with, and then the next big one obviously is Vietnam, and then covertly, the role of the CIA all throughout Asia, in the Philippines, and Indonesia, and it goes on and on. There was this wonderful thing, we're going to use it in the film. It was called, people should look it up, it's the Friendly Dictator Playing Cards. And this brilliant artist worked with someone, and it's 52 playing cards. And on the side of each card is a beautiful artistic rendition of a dictator, American friendly dictator. On the back is a little history of that person. There's 52 cards in this deck. But in truth, if you investigate how many dictators who were brutal, vicious, undemocratic dictators have been put in power since from World War II to, say, 1990, for the sake of argument, it kept going. It's at least around 200. It goes back, and in Africa, it starts with the assassination of Lumumba. In the Congo, it goes on and on and on. So every attempt to build a more democratic form of socialism was crushed. So if people want to know why we haven't seen it, that's why we haven't seen it. It doesn't mean it can't be done.
A few comments to add to the stuff you just mentioned. So there's an article by Friedrich Engels about the transition from an ape to a man and the role of labor in the dialectic relationship. So that's one. Two, about the existence of a class society, even for the ones who refuse to believe it. Even someone like Barack Obama had said that he's fighting for the middle class. It was termed middle class economics. Joe Biden was appointed for it. But we don't have to talk about whether he was successful or not. But just the admission that there's a middle class clearly alludes to the presence of an upper and a lower class, because you have to be in the middle of everything. And then the final comment, I guess, if people want to read more, because this is, and if you want to think about it a bit more, the Communist Manifesto starts with the opening line of it is the history of all hitherto existing societies, the history of class struggle. So clearly in this historical context that you provided, class conflict is at the root of it. This is no time. If you liked what you just watched or listened to, then please consider supporting this project. You can subscribe on YouTube, follow on Spotify, rate 5 stars on Apple Podcasts.